I'm the ANCA president, and I have the pleasure to host here in the ANCA room this important press briefing organized by the Wall Street Journal. Journalism is not a crime, the wrongful detention of Evan Gershkovich. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you all for being here. I leave the floor to our moderator, which is our Pamela Falk from CBS and former ANCA president. So thank you, Pam. I leave the floor to you.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Valeria, and to UNCA, the UN Correspondents Association, for sponsoring the briefing. Obviously, this issue is about the fact that journalism is not a crime, and Valeria mentioned the title. It also looks to talk to what it means for the media and journalists reporting in and about Russia. Evan's arrest and detention has gone on for nearly 6 months. It's the first time since the Soviet era that Russian authorities have accused a U.S. journalist of espionage, sending an alarming message to all journalists covering Russia. The briefing provides an update with colleagues from the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones, CPJ, as well as the UN Rapporteur on what can be done on the day that the Wall Street Journal did file a letter to the Special Working Group, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, looking for the same designation that the US delivered, which was to say that Evan was wrongfully detained. We have a wonderful panel here. On remote is Mariana Katzarova, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Russian Federation, Conti, the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of Dow Jones. Gulnoza is the Europe and Central Asia Program Coordinator for CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and Paul Beckett right here is the Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal. I want to start with a few questions to them, and then we'll turn to my colleagues here. So to both Paul and Jay, first of all, how is Evan doing? Have you heard from him often? And what is the letter about that you have sent to the UN today?
Thank you very much, Pamela, and thank you all for coming. I know it's an incredibly busy time at the UN, so we really appreciate you taking time to come and discuss these incredibly important issues. How is Evan doing? As best we can tell, he is doing pretty well under the circumstances. He's young, he's healthy, he seems a very robust young man. The circumstances are that he's been held for nearly 6 months in a security services prison in Moscow since he was taken at the end of March. So every day that goes by for us is a day too long that he has been wrongfully detained. But in terms of his day-to-day well-being, we do get letters into him, letters out to him. He has visits from lawyers and occasionally from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. So the reports are that he is in decent shape.
All right, and would you tell us what the letter was about?
Sure, thanks for having me. I like to put this in days. Today is day 167 of Evan's wrongful detention. Nearly 6 months, as Paul said. And we are every day thankful that he is strong and he is in good health and in good spirits. He has tremendous Russian lawyers on the ground who get in to see him regularly, and that is his main outlet to being able to communicate with others. But make no mistake, he's been in Lefortovo prison for 167 days for nothing more than committing the act of journalism. Today we filed a petition, as Pam mentioned, with the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. The idea is to ask the working group to urgently declare and issue an opinion declaring Evan as having been arbitrarily detained, stating that Russia has not lived up to its obligations under international law and the way he's been treated and the way this case has progressed, and urgently demanding that Russia release Evan. That's what we've asked in the petition today, and that has happened in other cases, and it's a mechanism under the UN in order to do that. There are a variety of different legal things that we probably don't want to get into. It's all in the petition, but the idea is, in essence, that his international rights have been violated, that this is nothing more than hostage diplomacy, Russia taking an American in order to get something in return, and he should be freed immediately. He is obviously not a spy.
Thank you. And there are a lot of other UN agencies that you've contacted. Let's come back to that. I did want to ask both of you about your reporting on a possible swap that Russia is looking to get back Vadim Krasikov, possibly in exchange for Evan. What have you heard on this?
From our reporting, I think it is clear, and the Russians have said as much, that they've made comments like, we would not countenance a prisoner swap until after Evan has been convicted, and statements like that, from which we have drawn a natural conclusion that at some point they are interested in potentially swapping him. There are, around the world, as we and others have reported, a relatively small number of Russians that could potentially be possible swaps for Evan and other detainees. There's others in Russia, obviously. Paul Whelan's been there much longer than Evan has. So that is, on the news side, that has been our reporting. I'll have to defer to Jay on anything else you can say about the government.
Yeah, and obviously, as reporters, you all know, there's sort of a news side, and then there's the advocacy side, and we obviously keep a wall between those two at the Wall Street Journal and our efforts here. In terms of discussions with the administration, I'll keep those private, but we have seen in the past, certainly prisoner swaps have been one of the ways to resolve a situation like this with Russia and in other countries. From our perspective, we have a reporter who was committing great journalism taken off the street while literally in the middle of reporting journalism. And for that, special attention needs to be taken, and every path needs to be explored to get him back, regardless of what that means. And so our job is to explore every possible path with the U.S. government and foreign governments to try and get Evan home to his family, his mom, his dad, and his sister as soon as possible.
Thank you. All right, I'd like to turn to the UN Rapporteur, if we have the sound okay, to Mariana Katzarova, to answer the following question. What can the UN do? Have you received this letter? Is it under consideration? And then we'll come around and then get to your questions. Were you able to hear that?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I can look here.
Sorry, can you hold on a second? Because we're trying to fix the sound.
Oh, yeah, maybe just put the mic on it.
Do you think it will? I don't think it will go.
Just put the mic at the speaker, yeah.
Hold on. Just 1 second. Can we try now?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is it? Do you want me to speak louder?
Speak up as much as you can.
All right. Yes, thank you for your question, and good evening from Europe. We have received, not only have we received information about the detention of Evan Gershkovich, but with my colleague, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, Irene Khan, we have taken communication, immediate action vis-a-vis the Russian authorities. We addressed the authorities on 12th of June. There are rules to these communications. Obviously, we have to wait for 60 days before to give a chance to the government to respond to this communication. However, in the meantime, we have taken up publicly, we issued a call for the immediate release of Evan Gershkovich based on the fact that he was arbitrarily detained for the exercise of his profession as a journalist, and really nothing to do with the serious charges he's facing on espionage. Also, his case is a very indicative case of the escalation of repression against not just foreign media in Russia, but the Russian media. My 16 or 17 years ago, my close friend was Anna Politkovskaya. And when Anna was murdered then, 17 years ago, nobody was extremely bothered because it was kind of one-off. However, during this time, gradually, for the past 20 years, 43 journalists were killed in Russia, Russian journalists, and so many more were detained. And I think Russia has always been, even according to, I think it's CPJ with the global media index, impunity index, where Russia was, for 2021, was on 10th place for the worst treatment of media journalists and media workers in the world. What happened to Evan is, of course, the latest of a series of escalating repression. And of course, he's a foreign journalist, he's a correspondent, traveling on a mission to Ekaterinburg with the escalation of repression in connection to the war in last year. The charges of espionage, treason has really, I don't know how many times, not doubled or tripled, but we have, for example, only in 2023, in the first 7 months, 80 people were charged with treason in the Russian Federation. Last year, there was 16 people convicted on charges of espionage and treason. So I think it's a massive escalation of the use of these charges to really silence independent media, but also any anti-war expression, any independent opinion, period. So I think he has to be released immediately. What can the UN do? We are doing it from our side. I'm the first Special Rapporteur on the Russian Federation. I will be delivering my first report. I'm the first because this mandate was adopted and voted by the Human Rights Council precisely because the situation in Russia for human rights, for freedom of expression has deteriorated so much that there is a special mandate, and I'm the first mandate holder. I will be delivering on 21st of September next week at the Human Rights Council my first report. And although I'm not at liberty to reveal its substance yet, I can reassure you that there is a call for the release of Evan Gershkovich and for the release of any other media worker, journalist, or human rights defender arbitrarily detained like he has been in Russia, Russian and foreign. So we're continuing to raise the case. I'm speaking at the General Assembly on the 25th of October. We're having side events. I'm participating in a side event organized by NGOs and states. Same in Geneva next week. I'm participating in 2 side events. Obviously, I will be raising his case and the whole, the whole situation in Russia in respect to journalism and media.
Thank you very much, Mariana. I'm sure we have more questions for you, but you made a good link to CPJ. And so I'd like to turn to Gulnoza to talk about the situation. Do you think the United States is doing enough? Are other countries doing enough to weigh in? And what is CPJ doing? Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me today. I just wanted to quickly go back to the statistics Madam Rapporteur shared briefly, and also want to reiterate that Russia has never been a safe place for journalists. In 1992, we started keeping record of journalists killed and jailed in countries around the world, and Russia has had more than 80 journalists and media workers killed in retaliation for their work and more than 30 of them were killed in contract-style murders, and Anna Politkovskaya is one of them, of course, and she is one of the most prominent cases, but also there was Paul Klebnikov, for example, an American journalist who worked with Forbes in Russia and was also murdered in Moscow, and impunity, complete impunity continues in his case. We have documented many cases of not just murders of journalists and imprisonments of journalists, but also physical attacks that have never been investigated in Russia, even prior to the beginning of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. But what happened with the detention of Evan Gershkovich is that we understood that nobody was immune from the repressions of the Kremlin and of the Russian authorities, because where I sit at CPJ, I deal with a lot of journalists who work across the region of Europe and Central Asia, including Russia. And when Russia adopted amendments to its administrative and criminal codes in March 2022, practically banning the use of the word war in regards of the invasion, and criminalizing any reporting that deviated from the Kremlin established narrative on the war, a lot of media outlets, including foreign media outlets who had their correspondents in Russia, reached out to us asking about potential repercussions of those legislations. And all foreign media outlets were considering whether they should continue keeping their correspondents in Russia or not, whether it was too risky or whether the Kremlin would not go as far as to bring these kind of very serious charges. Because what we saw until the case of Evan was that some foreign journalists had troubles with renewal of their visa and accreditation. That still continues. But the espionage charge is a very serious one, because we're looking Evan is looking to up to 20 years in jail if he is convicted, which is very likely. And we know from the history of the cases of those accused of espionage is that the investigations are very secretive, that the trials are held behind closed doors. And thank you to you and all colleagues of Evan, not just at the journal, but also those who knew and know him personally, for keeping the attention on him. And as to your question, Pam, what we're trying to do in regards of Evan, of course, our position from the very beginning when we learned about the detention was that he should be immediately released, because he is a journalist who was in Russia doing journalism, and he was one of very few people who provided that window into the Russia. Because what happened after the full-scale invasion is that dozens of journalists started fleeing Russia as soon as they understood that any reporting, independent reporting, may land them in jail. They started fleeing to neighboring countries, and Evan was one of very few journalists who continued doing the journalism that we all need. We need people on the ground, because yes, you can work from exile, reach out to people inside Russia, but as I usually say, I'm a journalist myself, that you need people there on the ground to talk to people, and then to describe the situation there, people's opinions, people's feelings, and even the environment they work in, the smells they can smell there, which you can't do simply by Googling or Zooming. And it's very important that we continue this work supporting Evan. And we also have been supporting a lot of Russian journalists in exile. As you know, we do not just press freedom advocacy, but also assistance. We provide grants to journalists, including journalists from Russia, and we have been assisting them financially and with mental health support, because the impact of fleeing Russia on Russian journalists is also very, very hard. And going back to Evan's case, now we know that nobody is safe. And it's very important to continue demanding the release of Evan from the Russian jail.
Thank you so much, Gulnoza. We have a lot more to cover, and Evan does speak Russian, right?
He does, yeah, he does. And he was
Advantages.
raised in Russian emigres, where his parents who left the Soviet Union in 1979. He speaks fluent Russian.
Interesting part of the scenario. So I will now turn it to my colleagues, even though I know you. Would you please introduce yourself and your news organization? Thanks. You can say if it's for one person or another.
Thank you, Pam. Valeria Robecco from ANSA Newswire.
I'm sorry, first question goes to the UN Correspondents.
And thank you again for being here. So my question is, are you planning to raise this matter in any way next week during the high-level week here at the UN? Do you have any chance, to bring again the attention on this matter? Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is we're working on it. We certainly hope that various delegations, including the U.S. delegation, bring this case and make sure it remains front and center. I think for all the reasons that have been discussed here, this is a troubling change. A country like Russia takes Evan, clearly just a reporter. What stops others from taking journalists and using them as bait in the same way if there is no consequence? And I think this is a case to be focused on where the world is watching. Well, what do you do when a journalist is taken? What does the international community do? Do we all shrug our shoulders and say this is what happens and this is how Russia has behaved? Or do we pivot to a new model where the coalition of countries who care about a free press decide to collectively take action, whether that's sanctions or some other collective action against Russia to prevent it from happening in other jurisdictions? I think that's the piece of this case that is particularly troubling and comes a bit out of left field and surprised lots of folks who were experts in this space, where they thought there was an exception. They thought Western journalists, this wasn't going to happen to them, and now it has. So what are we going to do about it? And it's key. It's key during UNGA week, and it's key during every single week, which is part of our mission, is to get this case out there in front of as many people as we can and say we can't just shrug our shoulders, because this will keep happening if that's the consequence.
All right, we have Amelie and then Camilla and then Evelyn. Yeah.
Thanks. Amélie Bottelier from AFP News Agency. I'm wondering what you expect in terms of helping you pushing Russia to help to release Evan with this petition to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, considering that Russia doesn't really care about what the UN body think or ask them to do. I mean, they disregarded several UN General Assembly resolutions and even rulings of the International Court of Justice. So what do you expect that even a positive decision from the UN Working Group could help achieve?
Yeah, fair question. I think the answer is that we're looking to pull every lever we possibly can. We're a company that respects laws and processes that exist. This is one of those processes that's available to us. It also sends a message to all of the countries in the UN that we go through the UN process. We believe in this case enough to go through this exercise to make sure that we get this designation as well. And it sends that message to other countries that this is something that we take quite seriously. Whether what Russia does with it is out of our control, clearly, but we want the world to be able to see it's not just the US that designated Evan as wrongfully detained, which they did back in April, but the UN has taken a look at this under their own separate standards and have made an independent judgment that he's being arbitrarily detained and he should be released. And for us, we want to create the momentum to put pressure on Russia to say, this is a bridge too far. You shouldn't have taken this journalist who's committed journalism and claimed he was a spy. We're not going to tolerate it.
Does anyone else? Okay. Camilla.
Thank you very much for the briefing. I'm Camilla Antakhobi, Chief Editor of The Independent Persian. As what I learned, Ivan was speaking fluently Russian, you mentioned, and I would like to know if he was a dual citizen. And has he been accredited with his American citizenship or with his Russian citizenship? And what is the law in Russia? For example, in Iran, the authority doesn't recognize any dual citizen. For example, if I travel in Iran with my American passport, I can be detained and considered as an Iranian national. national. What is the law enforcement in Russia, and is it any chances you can have a prisoner swap? Anyone here in the States can be exchanged with Iran in exchange of the both Russian kind of citizens. Thank you.
I'm going to leave that to the law.
Evan was born and raised in the United States as an American citizen, not a dual citizen. So that issue doesn't really arise here, but certainly in a lot of different cases where there is dual citizenship, the country doesn't recognize the dual citizenship. If you're a country of that, a citizen of that nation, then that's all they care about. That's not quite at play here. And in terms of swaps, I mean, certainly everything is on the table. You look at every possible individual. That's part of the exercise that we've gone through. You know, the U.S. doesn't have a large number of high-profile Russians in custody at the moment.
Thank you.
Evelyn?
Thank you, Wonder Woman, Pamela. Just for background, he's being charged with espionage, which is a joke on the surface of it. But was he working on Wagner group in Catalina? And if so, look what's changed there. I'm just wondering if that's what he was working on, considering what President Vladimir has said about Wagner. I don't know if that's part of your argument or not.
Understood. He was covering Russia. He was a Russia correspondent for us. You're all very good journalists. I don't know any news organization that encourages people to talk about stories they're writing about before they are published. So if you looked at what he had been working on, it was very economic related to Russia. He had, obviously, the Russian economy was a huge focus of the last couple of years for all news organizations, and that was his beat. So beyond that, I hope very much one day he will come back and write about whatever he's working on. So we'll see it then. We were not going to talk about what he was working on specifically.
Yes.
Hi.
Oh, wait, you need a mic. Hold on.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jen Kalfas. I'm from the Wall Street Journal. I wanted to ask, you mentioned this just now. You mentioned that kind of lack of high-profile Russian prisoners in the U.S. I wanted to kind of ask a little bit more directly based off of the journal's reporting about Krasikov in Germany. Just curious if there's any hope specifically about that case as a possible swap that might ensure Evan's release. We discussed this already a little bit, but just wanted to ask a little more directly again.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think from our perspective, our job is to look for anyone who's a possibility anywhere on the planet who could be part of any kind of deal. Our main goal at the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones is to get Evan released. And so our job is to pursue any lead that exists, and that would include in Germany and other countries. And we've been doing that for the last number of months with people who have unfortunately developed an expertise in this trade, which has become unfortunately more and more common of late.
Now, hostage-taking extortion has increased, correct? Isn't that what you were saying?
Evan is a hostage of the Kremlin diplomacy. He is a pawn in this game. And Russia definitely has, you know what Putin likes to say, to use this word многоходовочка in Russian, which means multiple moves in a game, like a game of chess. And obviously when he was, as far as we understood from talking to the journalist, he personally approved the detention of Evan Gershkovich beforehand. And when he was approving, he probably thought about these as a potential bargain and who he can swap Evan for, because what some Russian journalists told me is that he was very pleased with the result of the previous swap of the U.S. athlete for Viktor But, the arms dealer who was in a U.S. jail. So right now, I'm sure the U.S. authorities have to work with their allies, with other countries, including probably Germany, who may have Russians in their detention, because just as Putin said, it's going to be a многоходовочка with multiple moves and probably even multiple people who are going to be, multiple individuals who are going to be eventually swapped for Evan and maybe Paul Whelan. But I also wanted to reiterate that the most immediate gain from Evan's detention is to silence him and to force him stop reporting, because what he was reporting on was not something that the Kremlin liked, the Russian authorities liked. And also, when we saw other cases of journalists, for example, last month, we documented the cases of a Finnish journalist and Dutch journalist who did not get their accreditation and visa extended in Russia. And they had to go back to their respective countries to continue reporting on Russia from outside the country. And their reports included, for example, a report on Alexei Navalny, or on Maskalkov, who reported, who's not a journalist, but whose daughter drew something in a kindergarten that some people there deemed pro-Ukrainian. Or one of those journalists did a profile of Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and that prompted Russian officials immediately react to it and say, oh, it's fake news, it's not true, whatever was in that profile. So whatever deviates from the Kremlin narrative on the war or on other issues, be it world affairs or sports, that is going to be immediately blocked. The Kremlin has been trying to put a tight lid on any reporting of the sort.
You know, I think that's a fair point. The only consequence of having taken Evan is not only silencing Evan's reporting, but a lot of reporting out of Russia, and that was most acutely felt during the Wagner Group and the uprising with Prigozhin. The reporting wasn't as detailed and informed as it would have been had you had more people on the ground in Russia. We're all feeling those effects right now, and that's what I mean by consequences. There haven't been any consequences to date.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Alex Baluku from Uganda. I am one of the DAG fellows for this year.
The Dag Hammarskjöld Fellow.
Oh, yeah. My question is one, how has Evan's case affected the work of other journalists in Russia and perhaps their ability to report on sensitive issues? Thank you.
I think as we've been talking about, it's had quite a chilling effect, and I think what few American, certainly US-based reporters were there at the time were withdrawn. I'm not aware of, maybe, last I heard anyway, that most of the major US publications had looked at this example and thought they were but for the grace of God, so they withdrew. Now, whether they will go back at some time will be their decision, but I think it has had a chilling effect. And what you've seen is there's a lot of great foreign correspondents working in Russia. There's a lot of great Russian reporters working in Russia. There's a lot of great foreign correspondents working there. And they've set up shop outside of Russia, Berlin, Dubai, Warsaw, little pods of people from publications that have congregate outside and do what they can to report into Russia, but there's nothing that can replace being there on the ground. So in terms of the depth of reporting that we had a year or a couple of years ago compared to now, I think there's been a significant difference. And I think in terms of what bigger story is there at the moment than Russia, and the world is being deprived of that reporting.
And I'm sorry, go ahead. And then I want to pull in Mariana on some of these questions. Yes.
Yes, hi, thank you so much. I'm Victoria Kupchinatsky, Voice of America. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on this possible swap? Where did this idea come from? Who initiated it? And do you know if there are any discussions on the official sides? The kind of how far has it moved forward?
It's a good question. I understand why you're asking it. I'm not really able to get into any of the details, other than to say that we're aggressively pursuing any possible avenues for swaps with the various people who would be kind of involved in those kinds of discussions. Other than that, it's really too early to discuss in any detail.
And in this case, it is Germany, correct?
Well, our reporting was that
Yes.
there's a possibility there. So obviously, again, the reporting side and the advocacy side, even within our own company, are two separate sides.
And ultimately, these are government-to-government negotiations, right? I'm on the news side, so I haven't.
Are they happening is the question.
I think it's great to put those questions to the governments who are involved.
I think if you look at the public statements from a few weeks back, we got the glimmer when the Russians said, they were in active conversations. The Russians said that. A day or two later, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan came out and said, yes, there are conversations, and so far they have shown no path to a resolution. So I think there's two things: are there conversations, and are they going anywhere? Are two questions, and I took from that. Those are the two answers I go back to when I think about that question. So, but it's very hard for us.
One personal question I have, not personal, but personal about Evan is, what kind of things is he allowed to write? Is he, obviously everything's being watched.
Yeah, he is able to receive and write letters back and forth to a number of individuals, and they do go through a prison censor and the like, but I think that's one outlet that's been extremely useful, frankly.
And I'd like to ask, I keep pointing over here, but to Mariana to just answer, okay, I'll come back, I didn't see it.
I have also a question.
Just to Mariana to answer what was the previous question about, I think it was Amelie's from AFP, of what, do you think Russia takes note of the letter of the UN Rapporteur?
I actually wanted to kind of say a few things around your discussion. Just to add, I wanted to say first that there was a previous question that about at least 1,000 journalists, it was on the effect of Evan's detention on the Russian journalists as well, and the whole situation. So more than at least 1,000, but maybe much more, many more journalists have left Russia in 2022, facing persecution, imprisonment, or closing down of independent media outlets. So that's not a small number, and these are some of the top people actually in the country in media. In terms of whether and how to go ahead, I was listening with great interest to what my fellow participants in the panel were outlining about advocacy and a swap and all the strategies possible in order to engage the international community. I think it's extremely important to engage Russia, of course, and the Russian government on the level of the Security Council. I think, listening to you, I was thinking, Russia is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Russia has fellows, other countries' members, as well as non-permanent members. And there is also the Secretary General and his good offices for facilitating communication and negotiation. And I think it's extremely important, this kind of 2 avenues of action. And also focusing on Evan, but also focusing on all other journalists in the world that are at the moment targeted and taken hostage and taken in detention in order to, to be used in some kind of game or some kind of, material for exchange, for swap. And mainly to silence their reporting. I think it's a very important conversation, and it actually has to happen in the Security Council, because we need the higher leadership of the United Nations and the permanent membership saying, well, mea culpa if there is any persecution in their countries, but also what can they do to take action, to begin with Evan Gershkovich, but there are others. So there should be some kind of reloading of our system of affection within the United Nations. We're all doing our bit. Me as a special rapporteur, I'm sure the working group on arbitrary detention is very important because actually somebody was asking, it's precedent setting, it's a strategic litigation tool of coming up with not a judgment because it's not a court, but with a pronouncement. And on Russia, for example, we have a pronouncement by the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, which is on the arbitrary detention of a local politician who openly spoke at one of the meetings, Mr. Gorinov, at one of the meetings of the local council, he spoke against the war in Ukraine. And therefore, he was charged, detained, and sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. And the working group had a great pronouncement on his case, but on similar cases as well. So that's very important. In terms of whether the Russian government is paying attention, my mandate, the Russian government declared even last year, actually something interesting for us as, I'm a former journalist, but for you a journalist, the resolution adopting the mandate and pronouncing the mandate of my mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Russia was adopted at the Human Rights Council on 7th of October, which was the day, not only of the birthday of Mr. Putin, but it was the day when Anna Politkovskaya was murdered. And it was a coincidence, I believe, but it was very symbolic that even the resolution, which will be asking for justice and pushing for changes in the human rights in Russia, had some significance and connection to the persecution of journalists. However, the Russian authorities, although I asked several times for access to the country, for cooperation, they haven't granted such to my mandate, and they do not recognize my mandate. This is what they declared in recent communication, or an interview by the ambassador in Geneva, who gave an interview on Russian television. They even said he said in this interview that I'm an active Russophobe, not just passive, but active Russophobe personally. Although when asked to explain why on Russian television, he said it's because look where she worked before. And I worked at Amnesty International, I worked at the UN, at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. If these are Russophobic organizations, that these are the human rights mechanisms of the world, I may say, of civil society and of the United Nations. So no, it's not a friendly, the Russian government hasn't been friendly to my mandate so far, but no government likes to be put under a microscope and analyzed, including the Russian government. I don't lose hope that I will continue communicating with them, even if it's one way. But I think most importantly, it's the world to hear what I have to say as a special rapporteur, or what US journalists or civil society has to say. So it's approaching the government, but also loudly speaking up and calling for, including for the release of Evan Gershkovich and other journalists and other human rights defenders. And lastly, I just want to say, Evan very much reminds me of myself and my colleagues from Columbia University Journalism School 30 years ago. I'm the first Bulgarian who went to Columbia Journalism, and I'm a class of 92. All of us bought one-way ticket to the nearby, any available war zone or a difficult country of repression, just to go and break the news, just to go and write about it at his age or even younger. And I think he has been not just now working for the Wall Street Journal, but his whole story of journalism was one of romantic love for the mother country of his parents, knowing Russian, loving the culture of the country, loving the country. So I think his engagement and being in Russia and then being hired by the Wall Street Journal was just one of being in love with the mother country that he never grew up in. So for him to be targeted as a spy and facing 20 years, I think it's crushing. It's not just a journalist being silenced or a foreign journalist. It's somebody who was born in an immigrant family and went through all probably the issues of immigrant children, thinking, oh God, my parents speak English with an accent. And, you know, being now the correspondent in the same country of his parents and now in prison. I think it's a personal tragedy and a tragedy for all of us. But I think we need to be bold. I think we need to be active and really to shout about Evan and other journalists and really reload the system of protection for journalists and media workers around the world.
I think that's a very positive mandate. We have time for one more question, Carrie.
Thanks, Pam. Hi, my name is Gulnoza and I'm working for Le Monde and Radio France Internationale. I used to be based in China for a long time. You answered nearly all my questions, ma'am, Special Rapporteur. I just have one more detail to ask you. Are you traveling to Russia? How are you meeting with all these journalists? How are you doing your report? Concretely, how are you working?
Yes, unfortunately, the Russian authorities did not grant me access so far, although I asked several times for access to the country. I am meeting, my resolution is entitling me to meet Russians, including journalists, dissidents, civil society, anybody really from the Russian community outside the country. And that's what I'm doing. I had a huge consultation with civil society, with journalists as well, from inside Russia and outside Russia. So I received more than 100 submissions, detailed submissions, including the submission on Evan Gershkovich from his lawyers to inform the writing and preparation of my first report. I should just say, unfortunately, these reports are worse than writing an op-ed in Wall Street Journal, I suppose. It's 10,700 words only. It's 20 pages for an enormously huge country, but also a country with enormous issues in human rights. So it's 20 pages. Don't expect huge detail, but we will continue. Hopefully my mandate will be voted again and renewed at this session. And if that happens, I will continue in this mandate for the next 6 years, hopefully with the Russian government in the future giving me access to the country.
Thank you, Mariana. See how it changes when you change from the UN, from journalism to the UN? 10,000 words sounds like a lot to me. Camila had just one quick follow-up.
Sure, very quick question. Just to follow up, have you reached to any foreign countries such as Qatar or United Arab Emirates to intermediate between Russia and the United States for his safe release?
Yeah, our efforts. Our efforts aren't just contained to the U.S. We've reached out to a variety of different countries to sort of assess whether or not they can be useful. And there's been a lot of interest in this case. I think the publicity has assisted that effort. They understand that this is a bogus charge of espionage and want to help where they can. So we have seen a lot of interest.
Any closing?
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your interest. It means a lot to us. Thank you.
All right. I would like to thank Mariana, Jay over here, Gulnoza and Paul for their insights. One would hope somehow Evan hears that people are making global appeals for his release. And I thank our distinguished president of the UN Correspondents Association, Valeria, for joining us. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.